I was really surprised. I thought, when you said I've written a book, I thought, well, okay, it'll be a little pamphlet.
Well,
no,
my
I
first
did.
book
This is
certainly
what I was
looks
thinking.
like that.
There's people who say, well, I've written a
this.
book on something, and they come in with a little thing like this. You came in with that. It's a major work. Major work. Congratulations. You're a scholar.
Did you, but you've read most of it.
Of course.
All
right,
guys. In 10, 9.
Okay, thanks,
8,
man.
7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2.
Welcome, 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 welcome to Conversations and to a program with a friend of mine. We're going to be talking about a book that he's written. I was just mentioning to him how impressed I am with it, and that's Jack Ross. And he's written a book. I'm going to hold it up here if you can get it on a one-shot. This is the Socialist Party of America, The Complete Story. A Complete Story. And I wanted to share with him, if you don't mind, Jack, you and I are friends. You had told me that you had written a book, and I thought, well, we would like to put a program together about the Socialist Party in America, and I had in mind, 40 pages or something like. And you've written a 700-page tome, which is a work of great intellectual rigor and amazing, major contribution to the American understanding of an important part of our history. And I congratulate you as a scholar and intellectual of the highest order.
Well, thank you. It's always a pleasure to see you and to be on the program.
No, but it's a major work. I congratulate you on it. So why don't you, Jack? We're going to just, Jack, we just share with us your background, born and raised and that sort of thing, and then we want to talk about the book and about the concept of socialism and its role historically and in perhaps the future tense. But could you share your own background, born and raised, some of your education, that kind of thing?
Well, I grew up just outside of Washington, D.C. in Bethesda, Maryland, and my family background actually has a lot to do with why I wrote this
I saw
book.
that in the beginning, yeah.
Well, my great-grandfather, who was also Jack Ross, came over from Poland when he was still a teenager and was active socialist and trade unionist for a very long time, more or less his whole life, depending on definitions. And then somewhat more salient, and in some ways more salient on my mother's side. My mother's parents were not members of the Socialist Party, but they had many friends who were. They were in the labor movement. My grandfather was very much in the leadership of the CIO in 1940s and 50s, and I had a number of, I guess, radical political experiences as I guess, late adolescent, college age, but historiographically speaking, it was the same time as a lot of those experiences, confronting how much of the memory of the communist left and the Communist Party a historical memory of radicalism, and certainly of labor radicalism. And having come from the family background I did, this was disconcerting because my family background was squarely in the non-communist left, and even in the research for the book I discovered just to how great an extent my grandfather and his brother, who were both came out of the Steelworkers Organizing Committee, and again were not members of the Socialist Party, but the extent that by the 1930s, where certainly by the second half of the decade, the Communist Party was a lot more dominant, more influential, but you did, even though the Socialist Party organizationally was on a steep decline, you still had, through the end of the 30s, and really only broke up over the debate over intervention, World War II before Pearl Harbor. But in my research, I did discover that in the late 30s, they were very squarely on the non-communist, of that broader non-communist left in the trade union movement.
Yeah, that's saying a lot, because you're talking about two different things. When people think of the extreme left or something, they think of communism. And it does go, you go back to 1848 in Europe and to Karl Marx's contributions to understanding what we mean by socialism. And socialism remains a very big idea, but it's not all, it's been tarred and feathered, as it were, in the Cold War rhetoric and so forth between the United States and Soviet Union and that sort of thing. But socialism is a concept that has roots that are perhaps unique, and it's an important word to understand what exactly it means and what its prospect is and what its prospect might be in terms that will be relevant to the emerging situation in which we find ourselves now.
Well,
Yeah.
there's a lot to respond to there.
Yeah, I think so, yeah.
I mean, the word socialism is
Yeah.
very problematic to define, and has
Really?
been
Okay.
for a very long time. It really is very nearly semantic and can mean almost anything one wants it to mean. The way, at least in my view, it's as corrupted beyond reach any kind of consensus meaning as other political labels like liberal or conservative.
Where does the word first appear in terms of literature or so forth? What's the history of the word and also of the concept?
Oh, that's really beyond the purview of my book. I certainly don't deal with the pre-Marxians. Well, I think Robert Owen, who was an American in, I guess, 1820s, is probably the first where that word, where the word socialism emerges. I mean, I begin my narrative with the founding of what would become the Socialist Labor Party in 1876. And its rise and decline, as well as the more spectacular rise and fall of the populist movement in the 1890s. And Socialist Party was formed in 1901 by specific remnant or dissenting factions of each of those groups.
And what about in Europe? Was the term used historically in Europe, or?
Well, you had the Second International that was formed in 1889, I think.
Right.
That the Socialist Party was affiliated with, and they largely broke up over because of the First World War, and most of the parties supported their mother countries, and the communist movement to some extent arose as a consequence of that.
Well, the activity of 1848 and that major year of transformation in Europe, was the term used in that context or not?
I think in some context. That's really not what my book. My book is covering. But
I'm just wondering, because a lot of people there's a great deal of upset with the way the world's going now by a whole lot of people, as you can see as you look at the news and so forth. And many of the people will say, we just did a program with our friend Anthony Granovich, who's saying the thing is so messed up, we've got to have a major change to bring justice to the people of the world, and we're heading for a cliff and all that. And what we need, and very people will come trippingly off the tongue, what we need to do is get rid of capitalism and create socialism for the people. You know what I'm saying?
Well, part of me is sympathetic to that idea, at least in broad outline. Part of me, at least is, part of me is more cautious about exactly what that's supposed to entail, or what what the unintended consequences.
Well, if
of
you
that
say,
would
what's
be.
the alternative to capitalism, which sort of runs the world now, you can see, and most people would say the first thing that might come out of their mouth, socializing, socialize things. The government sector can take over responsibility in the name of the people rather than all the malefactors of great wealth and so forth is a general thing you hear in coming off the lips of people in the world.
Well,
know
I
what other
suppose
alternative.
this
There's
comes back to
cooperative.
my my definition with to the extent I deal in definitions. I guess in the introduction of the book. I mean, the term social democracy, at least, if you're dealing with a period before World War II, is, and certainly the early communist period, to what extent that term is even salient. I mean, I think that's ultimately semantic. I think the word capitalism can also ultimately be very semantic.
I suppose that's true, really. Yeah,
But
yeah.
I mean, as opposed to, now the American Socialist Party, who this book is about, were not, in the main, there would most of the time be a small faction who were, depending on the period, but who were revolutionary socialists. But in the main, these were not revolutionary socialists.
Okay, that's a distinction to be made.
Yes.
And you make that distinction.
Yes.
So it's worth bringing up.
Yes.
You think? Yeah.
Oh,
right.
absolutely.
Uh-huh.
I mean, they definitely were believers in the ballot box and the
Okay.
democratic process, and that's and in the period before World War I, the major counterpoint was the IWW, also in its
International
prime
Workers-
at that time, Industrial Workers of the World,
Yeah.
who believed in the general strike,
Yeah.
revolutionary idea. And then certainly after World War I, once the communists were on the scene, that distinction also took on a new significance. And then when I mentioned earlier about the disruption that came in the 1930s, how many basic concepts or prejudices that carried over from the legacy of the IWW as well as from the communists in the New Deal. I mean,
In the New Deal,
yes,
Roosevelt, yeah.
I mean, the paradoxical thing about Socialist Party 1930s is that they were at once to the left of the Communist Party and also to the right of the New Deal. Basically, as I see it, and certainly if you want to talk about current issues, I certainly find this very relevant to current predicament of the labor movement. Some viewers might be familiar with someone who's written a lot about that named Tom Gagan, whose views I find of basically arguing the same conclusions I'd come to independently. But basically, what I consider the historical background that's vital provided in this book about the New Deal and the regime of the Wagner Act. And certainly if you see Republican anti-union activities, how much they retreat into the Wagner, that they are now the solemn defenders of the Wagner Act bureaucracy of federally supervised elections, the solemnity of secret ballot and so forth, as opposed to a more independent form of organization. What I feel that the Wagner Act did is that it codified and created a bureaucracy to manage what in most labor movement language of that period would have been called the strike weapon, and that
Yeah,
that would be the
right,
primary means.
The right to strike
But
had
yet,
to be.
oh well,
also,
so yeah, well, the right
Yeah.
to strike, of course, is something else. But that would be the main means, protest, rather than politics, rather than working through the ballot box or through Independent Party of Labor.
And that would have
basically,
affected-
basically the New Deal idea was that behind the Wagner Act, that you would have this bureaucracy that managed and oversaw that protest over politics model of trade unionism as a way to operate within to operate within the capitalist system or power elite,
Within
as
the
opposed to.
capitalism,
And I mean, if you look at a lot of, to go back to Tom Gagan, if you look at a lot of the European models, and most of them do not have the same kind of many of those countries, there are exceptions, but many European countries, France and Germany and the UK, certainly have union density about as low, I think in the case of France even lower than the United States, but that you have very different models of organizing that are focused more on cooperative arrangements.
Okay.
There's cooperation and collaboration with business, but that do very much of the time involve a real stake in governance of businesses, and that developed along a very different model. My point is that, and it's, I guess, what that emerged in the 1930s with the Wagner Act and the rise of the CIO, and as of managed protest over politics and always serving the agenda of the power elite. That really, what that became was I guess a metaphor, a synecdoche of sorts, that that made that basically the model of all, from the most milquetoast liberalism to the most militant and obnoxious radicalism, that you simply supplication for the redress of grievances, always serving the agenda of the power elite. And what really set that in stone a generation later is the civil rights movement. Because for all that there is to admire about the civil rights movement, it had the underlying tragedy that it was a protest movement because of the failure of politics, the democratic process, for a century after the end of slavery to secure rights of African Americans. And really, that became a universal model. That's the whole story of the New Left, of that as a universal model of organizing. And really you want my whole critique of contemporary liberalism, and that the self-identified radical left is really indistinguishable in this respect. Really, there's no difference, whatever the degrees. The conservative columnist Ross Douthat, who put it best, for the neocons, every foreign crisis is Munich, but for contemporary liberals, every domestic crisis is Selma. And that really is the problem with whether it's the most milquetoast liberalism or very self-conscious and self-important radicalism, and certainly goes far to explain how so many aging 60s radicals are so comfortably in the camp of Hillary Clinton. And so in the book, I certainly go into much more detail about specific figures who shaped this process.
Yeah, and I'd like you, maybe let me show the book again, because we lacking a graphic. Who were some of the names that were associated back in the early 19th or the early 20th century? Names that are associated with this socialist movement that you're bringing such an important work to. Who were some of the leaders of that, and names that would be able to be identified?
Well, the most
general?
famous leader, of course, before World War I was Eugene Debs,
Yeah.
who had been a leader of the American Railway Union in the 1890s, and basically after the Pullman strike in 1894.
Was it 94?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and I mean, he became basically after the Pullman strike, and after he served a short jail sentence as a consequence of the Pullman strike, he basically at that time had the entire leadership of the populist movement his for the asking. He ultimately deferred to the candidacy of William Jennings Bryan in 1896, and then he began organizing independently after Bryan lost, and that was one faction. The other faction that came out of the Socialist Labor Party, which
yeah, go on.
was very rigid doctrinaire Marxist party. Friedrich Engels, who was still alive in the 1890s, even wrote a number of letters lamenting the Socialist Labor Party and urging on a kind of alternative. And the most important leader of the group that came out of the Socialist Labor Party that merged with Debs's following to form the Socialist Party was someone named Morris Hillquit, and he was a Jewish immigrant from what's now Latvia, who came to New York as a teenager. He was a lawyer. He was very he had maybe not a privileged background, but certainly was raised in a highly cultivated fashion. He was in a community that that was mainly German speaking and Russian, so that gave him a certain degree of cultural superiority. He was always most closely identified with the very broad socialist movement among Jewish immigrants in New York, Yiddish speaking, but he was always a peculiar cultural remove from them. Person who was most representative of the Lower East Side socialists, who even was elected to Congress in the years just before and after World War I, was named Meyer London. He was also a lawyer. He was deeply involved in union organizing and in the great shirtwaist strike in 1909, 1911.
That solidified a lot of people.
He was in 1914 was when he was first elected to Congress. He lost against a fusion candidate of both parties in 1918 because of the war. Was what compelled the two parties to fuse all over New York City.
Yeah.
In 1920, when the country was very disillusioned with the war, Warren Harding beat Wilson's appointed Democratic successor by what's still the largest margin of victory in a presidential election. I'm not sure how many people know that. Larger than even FDR or Johnson or Nixon. And it was Harding, of course, who pardoned Eugene Debs on Christmas Day 1921 after he had been sentenced to 10 years in prison for
Well, he
speaking
was
out
sentenced
against
to
the
10 years
war.
in prison for what? And what was he saying?
For
What was
giving
he
a speech
advocating?
against the war.
Against the war. Okay, now
Yeah.
the war thing will an attitude to a war situation will galvanize people to become interested in political things and things of that sort. And you're talking about these early people in the early part of the 20th century that are using the term socialist. And what is the attitude of the American population at whole toward the idea of socialism as a way of seeing the social organization or economic organization of a society, do you think? What set it apart? It was on the particular issue of the war, not on his general thinking about socialism as a way in which this country ought to be set up. You know, it's the
yes.
social.
Well, before the war,
You're talking about the Socialist Party of America.
well,
yeah.
before the war, there
The
was
First World War.
there was a large audience for the Socialist Party, and they had an opportunity that, for a complex host of reasons, was resisted. But certainly a large factor was the left wing, the revolutionary socialists who identified with the IWW and eventually became the core group that founded the Communist Party.
Now, when
but
did
that wasn't the only reason. It was more complicated. But
Yeah, of
certainly
course, it always
it is the
is.
case that during the war, in municipal elections in 1917, including Morris Hillquit running for mayor of New York, who got 22% of the vote, there was a large vote increase over the presidential election the year before and city elections in 1917, including most dramatically in New York, that if one had drawn a straight line would have would have led to 4 million votes for the socialists. They got 1 million just under 1912 and again in 1920. Eugene Debs ran from prison in 1920.
What was he in prison for?
He gave a speech against the war. He
Against
was
the war.
convicted
And what
under
year-
the
what year?
Espionage Act for urging draft resistance. Many viewers will obviously relate to the uses of that law to this day, and especially in recent years that have very little to do with espionage. And that is a point that does deserve emphasis.
Peaceniks.
Exactly.
At the time, were not to be countenanced.
Yes, but specifically for urging resistance to the draft. That was the main offense that people got imprisoned for. And I think in Debs' case that the judge even instructed only convict on counts of urging draft resistance and not of general speech. And sure enough led to conviction on 3 of 10 counts. Now there was an effort to form in 1920 a farmer labor party that could have conceivably gotten 5 or 6 million votes, and the socialists made some very bad missteps that year. In 1924, Robert La Follette ran.
La Follette's another name.
Got over, who was very anti-war, and he was key figure in
that was the war.
He was also a key figure in pre-war potential coalitions I described, specifically around the 1912 election. But now
the Socialist Party of America, is that a specific thing, or the socialist movement? It's different. There are different varieties of it.
In the book, when I use the term socialist movement, there were at different times, probably most notably in the 1930s, when there were groups that for one reason or another broke apart but still regarded each other, and this was a word that was used at that time in this context, comradely terms, even if there were differences between them. That in the book is how I use the term socialist movement. Now there are those, I referred earlier to a lot of the historians or historiography that exalts the importance of the Communist Party, particularly in the 1930s and to some extent the 1940s. they, you might find, often use the phrase socialist movement in a much broader and more misleading sense.
Yeah. But the socialists, the idea of the they're dissidents, and they're small on the whole in terms of the overall. We got the Democrat and Republican mainstream of political reality in the country and so on. These have been relatively small movements in terms of the political dialogue, of the political culture of the nation writ large. Right?
Yes,
and protest, and from what is called the left, socialism, left, are the two that go together? Or how do you make a distinction between? Hitler did call his system a National Socialism. So I'm trying to get down to the word socialism.
Well, that goes...
Particularly, Jack, I'd like to get down to it. How relevant is the idea of socialism, as we can come to understand it, to those who are saying there's a great deal of discontent and a great deal of dysfunction, systematic dysfunction in the world now, and people who are against the way things are going on now often say, the answer is socialism. And the understand the meaning of that word in terms of historical context is what I'm trying to get at from your book. And I'm just wondering, because there are people who think that's the way we should be going. What does it connote? How does it relate to the private sector, private property? Does it make a distinction between, private sector, public sector, organization of society, and private property? And what are some of the distinctions?
Well, I can't speak for anyone today. I mean, in my view, the label has lost its immediacy.
Socialism.
Yeah,
Socialism we shouldn't use.
For contemporary world. Not that there aren't very urgent
but you hear it being referred
imperatives for radical change. But from some people, and a lot of those people have a communist or pro-communist background.
Well, okay,
But now if we want to talk, as I define, and I'm not entirely comfortable with definitions, and they have to be taken with some caveats, and it's only to make a larger point that in the introduction to the book, how I define the distinction between socialism and social democracy. Not that I buy the distinction wholesale, but just for clarifying what we're talking about. And in the context of the book and the definition of social democracy as it relates to the historic American Socialist Party and movement, it means a political economy organized in the interest of the working class, particularly as represented by the trade union movement, which does not mean does not mean the abolition of private property.
There were some
of the rudimentary institutions of a market economy.
Yeah, the USSR, Soviet Socialist Republic. Muammar Gaddafi called his country the Jamhuriya Socialism. People use the term socialism generally to represent the interests of the masses of the people against the possessors of great power and wealth and so forth. It's generally used in that direction.
Well, the word democracy is also used very problematically by
you make a distinction
dictators in that part of the world, many of whom also call themselves socialists, and also, frankly, many Americans.
Is it so vague or something that there's no point in ever using the word socialism, is what I'm getting at. It's so vague and so susceptible to dissection that there's no point in even using the word in any descriptive way.
Well, context is important, as it certainly is with the word democracy.
You think socialism is associated with democracy?
Yes.
Okay.
My point was that both terms can ultimately be very abstract and mean very different things from their plainly accepted or substantive meaning, but still that doesn't mean there aren't contexts in which they're useful. I mean, I'm ashamed to say I'm not as familiar with a chapter and verse, and so I really should be and believe in its message of George Orwell's politics in the English language. That's certainly very salient to this discussion.
George Orwell.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, okay. So I'm just trying to get at. It's a gigantic work. You must have been working on this for a number of years or something, because
4
it's
years.
very well researched.
I began research 4 years ago. It took me a little over a year to write the first draft. The editing is what took longer, but I'm very pleased with how the editing process came out.
Yeah, it looks great. You got pictures as well and
Yes.
everything, and it's a massive tome. It's nearly 700 pages, jam-packed with good research that you've been doing on this very important subject and everything. I congratulate you on the book. You got many accolades and people who've signed on to the importance of it. What would you say is the book is it history, or does it have relevance to the contemporary political reality of, let's just say, the last 20, 30 years?
Well,
And
I
if so,
certainly feel
what
like
are the major
it
points
does.
where it comes out? And when there's a war, there's a great deal of national focus on particular, or there was a Great Depression, and there was a labor movement that grew out of that, and all of that.
Well, I guess if we want to talk about the period between the two world wars and extending just after, there are two, I guess I can keep a focus on two specific individuals who are very important. One was Norman Thomas, who led the party after Eugene Debs ran.
He ran forever. He kept
From
running
every
for-
election from 1928 to 1948.
He ran proudly, yeah.
And you talk about this being a small movement, and he was someone who never had illusions about that, and he only ever hoped to make the Socialist Party, only ever really or realistically aspired to make the Socialist Party central to the organization of a larger party. And the reason that the last time he ran was 1948 was because everyone thought Dewey was going to beat Truman, of course, and so there was an expectation that the Democratic Party might break up, and that would be the basis for a realignment or a Labor Party.
I see. Yeah. And do you think that would have had an effect on the outcome of that election? That he ran? Did he get as much vote as you thought? It might have influenced the election returns? It was pretty close, as I understand.
No, he never got more than 200,000 votes starting in 1936 forward. 1932 he got nearly 1 million, and that was right at the peak of the Great Depression.
Yeah, right.
The second figure who was very important to American history in this interwar period was A. Philip Randolph.
Really?
Who was?
Is he with the Porter?
Yeah, he started the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters,
right.
First major African American trade union, and he really was the most important forerunner of the civil rights movement before World War II. And this is critical to a lot of histories, because there have been many histories that exalt the role of the Communist Party in connection to struggle for civil rights. The variety of different problems with that narrative and why it's emerged is too complicated a subject of here. But specifically, Randolph in 1941 was the first one to call for a march on Washington. And
in 1941?
Yes, and that had to do with the issue of equal employment opportunities during the war in the war industries. And he called it off when FDR relented, and as soon as that he went straight ahead pushing for desegregation of the military, which happened under Truman. And then he was very on in years by the time, but it was really as a tribute to him, who was on the organizing committee along with many other longtime colleagues, that more famous March on Washington in 1963 got its name.
Yeah. So, what do you think the future of the concept or the history or the tradition of socialism is to the practical political organization of the United States of America or the world?
Well, we're a very different country than we were in the period that the Socialist Party was most active. And for some reasons that I've touched on, particularly at the beginning of this talk, there are a lot of for a lot of reasons that I, to a large extent, wrote this book as a response to that narratives about the Communist Party and its example and how it was, and yeah, as I explained earlier about the foundation of a lot of the New Deal architecture and that model of activism. And I find, and I mean, I would hope that this book can give some idea for a different and new and better. One could argue that it's less effective. I think that's an open question, but means do matter, and respect for democracy and frankly the inherent goodness of American people, how hard as that is to believe. I mean, I talk about how that quality changed again in that period of the 30s.
Go ahead. Is the thing Tom Hayden and the Students for Democratic Society and these kind of things that emerged in the 60s? What's the relationship of the movement of political movements that were popular, that continue perhaps, in terms of the socialist roots out of which they would have had some allegiance?
I am very glad you asked, and I am very glad you asked that question. I mentioned that the last time Norman Thomas ran for president was 1948, and that, in a much larger sense, marked the end of an anti-Leninist American left. And
okay.
in the early 50s, some viewers might have heard of, I can think of at least one or two people who would have talked about him on your program in the past. Someone named Max Shachtman, who in the early 50s basically reinvented the non-communist left, or as the term increasingly became the Cold War, democratic left.
Yeah.
And he was very close to Leon Trotsky, and he brought a lot of assumptions. And he basically, what he did was apply the model of the communist, the organizational model of the Communist Party in the 1930s, what's often called the Popular Front. He basically applied that to the non-communist left beginning in the 50s. That became very critical to laying the foundation for both the civil rights movement and the New Left. And his followers basically took over what remained of the Socialist Party at the end of the 1950s. Tom Hayden, who you mentioned, being central to this.
The Students for Democratic,
yes,
Port Huron,
yes.
yeah, right.
They
would be inspired by
well, there were direct organizational links as well.
Okay.
Now, the other reason this reinvention, I guess you might even call it the reinvention of the non-communist or anti-communist left into what became known as the democratic left, and that carried over these assumptions. Many of those closest to Shachtman, starting in the middle of the 1960s, turned on the socialist, turned on the New Left. It was complicated. There were those who did not. There were many who, unlike the core Shachtmanites, were opposed to the Vietnam War, but Hayden and others at the time became, frankly, partisan for the Viet Cong, though they did not become communists, but they did become openly partisan for the Viet Cong.
Shakmanites, yeah, that's a term that resonates in my memory.
Right.
Yeah, right.
And many of them became the founders of the neoconservative movement in the 1970s. And that really was the demise, and that essentially...
The neocons?
Yes.
Really, that's interesting, yeah.
And
who are some of those who might have picked up on that we could recognize?
Well, probably the most notorious was Elliot Abrams of Iran-Contra and more recent Israel-related infamy. And then there was someone named Carl Gershman, who has been the head of the National Endowment for Democracy for many years. Another would be someone named Josh Moravchik, who is sinecure at AEI, basically what happened was in the early 70s they formed an alliance with Norman Podhoretz around Commentary magazine, and it's interesting because in one of his more unhinged columns, I think in the time of the whole Syria crisis a couple of years ago, Norman Podhoretz was talking about, Obama conspiracy secret conspiracy to reconstruct isolationist social democracy or whatever such nonsense. And as late as the very late 1970s, Norman Podhoretz was still calling himself a social democrat. Is what's truly remarkable about
it is
that.
remarkable in that, isn't it? How that can happen, right? That's
Yes.
amazing. That's amazing that has happened. So again, you don't want to make projections. Where does it stand now? This is the year 2015. This is history. This is the background of an important part of intellectual concern about the human condition that's been characteristic and that sort of thing. Where do you think that best is represented in keeping with its roots in terms of the current political reality that informs this nation and in terms of the world, in the personages of or in the platforms of political entities that are seen within in the national dialogue?
I'm not sure how to answer that. I mean, I've said a lot already about where I identify a lot of the pathologies of
this is a history
very liberalism that are also shared by radicals, and including and perhaps especially certain very trendy, self-identified Marxists I can think of these days. If you've ever read, I'm not sure I want to name names. But,
okay, don't.
I mean, I'm not sure I could...
Are there many people of many different persuasions? You're talking about the neocons, who's amazing and everything.
Yeah.
Are drinking from the trough of the socialist traditions out of which it comes? How can such a thing happen? How many different camel's nose can you get into the trough of a concept that should be understood in and of its own
Well, this is
terms?
what
I'm
is so
trying to get at.
extraordinary about this subject, that, as I say at one time, organizations as disparate as the American Enterprise Institute and the War Resisters League.
Now, how does that happen? How is it that so many can drink from that? I guess everybody says we represent the people. You know, everybody's going to say we represent the people against the malefactors of wealth or whatever. But I don't know if you understand what I'm saying. But the socialist ideal has been there. Could we go back into ancient history? Jesus, or any of the people who were inveigling against the control of the people, or Spartacus, or some sort of a thing where they were trying to fight the corruption of the time in which they found themselves. That concept, much in many people's mind, it comes to be focused around the ideals that are moving out of this generally seen idea of a socialist philosophy that maybe has not had its day, but might. There are some who think that we're in for a major change in the political structure of the planet, and the title or the pedigree that they would draw upon would be very much out of the writings of so many of the obscure people maybe, but the intellectual writings of the people who had faith in a socialist notion of social organization. And particularly I know you're talking about the War Resisters League and the War Resistors and that sort of thing. And there's a good deal where you could get commonality drawing upon these roots or drinking from this trough that could be relevant to what's going to be emerging in the time ahead in a conflicted world that we live in 2015. There's major change in the wind.
There is.
Yeah.
I do agree that there is. I'm not, how it will play out in this country is an interesting question.
Or in the world.
The world as well.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm not sure. If I could say one.
Anything at all, Jack. Anything
If I
at
could
all.
make.
It's a major work
Yeah.
that you produced, and I congratulate
you.
you enormously on the research that went into it. It's
If
very
I could
detailed.
say one thing of some of the ways in which I feel I've changed, or
Yeah, I'm gonna
maybe
hold
it
it up
happens
again for the
in
camera.
the process of researching and
Maybe you
writing
come
this
in again.
book,
Thank you.
whether it's how I've changed, or a lot of it I feel is change in American liberalism and radicalism, and to large portions of American society in just the last 3 or 4 years. In other words, in the years since I began writing this book. I mean, and granted, it was probably already tenuous. I mean, it's how identity politics has completely run amok in
You
just the
think it
last
has,
few
yeah?
years.
Yeah, you think so,
And I mean, this was I mean, was already a very unfashionable humanist sensibility behind this book, and invoking, with respect to the historic Socialist Party, and I mean, many of the roots of that, and some more complex and more recent, in a lot of the history of liberalism, as I explained in connection to the book, or my analysis of it. I mean, but it has been so destructive, certainly in the last generation of progressive,
What has been
positive
so destructive?
change.
You're talking about a number of things, identity politics. What has been so destructive?
Well, identity politics, with a particular form and ferocity that it's taken very recently. I guess a lot of what drew me to this subject, beginning when I was very young, was recognizing about what you might call middle America, that how much of the sensibility, but how alienated they were from the elitism or cultural attitudes of
Elitism,
so
okay,
many
yeah,
contemporary liberals, and as well as radicals, and how much of it, and discovering what the roots of so much of what some might call the old right, or of populist movements. Certainly, when you talk about the larger base or other by the broadest definition of non-communist radical movements in the 1930s, and how that history all fit together, and how, and where and how the various disruptions came about. That motivated this. There's no concept, even the fact that you have not to deny, obviously, not to deny the racial legacy, the ugly racial legacies in this country by any stretch, but the fact that there are people who would find the concept "all lives matter" offensive as a response to
what? I'm sorry.
"all lives matter" as a response to refrain "Black Lives Matter." I will say I salute those I
Yeah.
would see on Twitter who put both of those side by side.
Uh-huh.
But the fact that there is such a for so many there is such a stubbornness to recognizing that when people talk about racism or colonialism or any of these things, that these are symptoms rather than cause. Almost no one that's of the self-identified left will say that anymore about and would even find the idea deeply offensive that these things are symptom and not cause. And frankly, as I feel, is a function of intellectual laziness and not wanting to really tackle root causes. And to bring it back to just simple domestic politics, I mean, I do believe there is a substantial majority in this country today for the kinds of reforms of our economy and for a more humble foreign policy, and for at least beginning the process of undoing and grappling with the legacy of the Bush years and civil liberties and torture. I do believe there is a substantial majority of the country ready for that and ready for a candidate who will do that, and it's completely obstructed by so much of the makers and gatekeepers of liberal opinion by identity politics, whether it's very crudely racializing problems of police brutality or the zeal or the untrammeled zeal of behind a lot of behind causes of gay marriage and issues related to that. And I'm not saying that, and the fact is that it's not that same majority is definitely left of center of what would have been the culture war spectrum 20 years ago, and yet that is what's so frustrating about it to me. I don't know how much.
No, we only got about a minute left.
Okay,
so round
that's
it out.
what
Yeah.
I thought. So
Yeah.
yes, so that is if there's one absolutely vital goal I hope to address with my book, it's to remind American progressives of a left that transcended all of that knew how to talk in majoritarian language, even when it wasn't the party of the majority, and
be inclusive.
yes, exactly.
Humanism, is there a room for that term?
Yes.
Yeah,
I used it earlier, so yes,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Well, I'll tell you, it's a major work. It's major work, and I congratulate you. An awful lot of work went into making this book. I'm going to hold it up one more time. It's a tome, ladies and gentlemen, and it's all well written, and it's by Jack Ross, and it's again called The Socialist Party of America, A Complete History. You could, if you wanted to, maybe make this like, volumes, but this is a major work, as I say, and it's all very researched with pictures and so forth. A major work, a major contribution to the intellectual understanding of things, and I thank you, Jack, very, very much for that. Thank you for viewing. We'll be thank you for viewing. We'll be coming back again tomorrow in the conversation series. Been your pleasure, Jack Ross, my dear old friend, Jack Ross. Thanks a lot for such a well-led life and for putting so much good intellectual work into this book.
Oh, you're very welcome.
Okay, thank you very much for viewing. Okay, well, we're 58-19, we're out, okay? Now, okay. It's a big subject, all right?
Yeah.
Boy, you walk out of those lights, you can't hardly see, because it blinds you, the light. So let me do a few things.
I almost forgot the microphone.
Yeah, you won't forget that. Now, bring that in here, Jack, would you? The microphone? We have to give that back. So, do you know how to do the finishing stuff we have to do? All we're going to do is we have to stop this.
Okay.
So, I guess that would be one way, stop and rewind, I guess. And it's so dark you can't see. And then rewind. Now, what about the DVD and the this one? I don't know what you have to do
I don't
there.
want to muck them up with that.
Take this bathroom.
Go,
That's
go,
good.
go,
Yeah,
go,
I know,
go,
all
go,
the
go.
water goes right through it.
Yeah, it does. Yeah.
Okay, just keep going
I know.
out. Yeah, okay.
Boy, he's something else, you
Yeah,
know.
he sure is.
He wrote that book. It really is a major
What
thing.
is it, 340,000 words?
Yeah, something like that. Is that how, did you see that? Is that in
Yeah,
the
it
literature?
took years for his first draft.
Yeah.
So
That's a work of,
You're right, it's a tome.
I think I'm going to have to just to sort of, because they changed it. In my experience, I thought that they would be here doing it all, and that the person who was here was just sort of learning or something. But now they've made it so that they don't do that, so that's a big change. I don't know that I'm going to be able to. He's already signed this.
Yeah, he signed one
Oh,
of them.
yeah.
You have two copies there, one for you, I guess, and one for him.
Yeah, okay. Well, okay, so I'm not sure. I may have to just put off airing that immediately. And what do I have to do? I have to get, what's this? This is Jack Ross. So this can go in here, eject.
And this was
And the one thing I don't know how to do,
Tony's. Somewhere.
Tony's DVD.
That's the one that's
I'm not sure if it is. Damn. It threw me for a loop that they did that. Tony. So this is Tony Granovich. So I gotta get the. Listen, thank you. Don.
You're quite. It's
I've
my
done-
pleasure.
my
I was
pleasure.
Very,
I
very
mean, I
happy
th-
to do it.
I
was
thank you.
absorbed.
I thank you for
I pitched
putting
it
up
for
with it all.
Jocelyn.
Yeah, right. Jocelyn
Yeah,
had to go to her
Jocelyn.
thing. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I've learned the way it's working. It isn't upstairs when you're in the studios upstairs. They do all the work.
Is there anything I need?
No, I've signed. Did you sign
I
it?
did.
Yeah, sign
Release?
one. Do you want to sign the other one?
No, it's just one. Just
Just
one.
need one. Okay.
Yeah, just one. It's done. So I don't know. I got screwed up. It's a measure that we did anything because it's a big bureaucratic snafu, and it's understanding the way they were going to do things here. And it used to be that the producer, what's this, Jack?
I'm not sure if I need it, but
Yeah, no, I don't have that. So I think that's it for now. Okay.
Yeah, no.
And I
so-
may have to add graphics to it, okay?
to the background.
Yeah,
Yeah, oh,
like
yeah.
they're supposed to have, in my way of thinking, the way I understood it, the guys upstairs who are the professionals would come here and do all the graphics and do all the stuff and everything, and then you have a person who's a producer learning, but they would do it. And that's the way they did it for a long time. Now they don't do it anymore. So they just left me cold, you know?
So when do you think you'll be?
I don't know.
You'll have it on YouTube.
Well, I might get it up on YouTube before I get it on the air.
Oh, I
I'm-
was expecting that. You think it'll be on the air a week from today?
I
That's what
don't
you
know.
told me
I don't
before.
know. I was going to be. I would have
Well-
hoped to. Wait a minute. Is this? Wait a
That's
minute.
Gloria.
Yeah.
Okay,
Okay,
well,
yeah,
nice
I
meeting
better
you.
be going. Yeah, it's very nice.
Better,
I'm not. Did I get your
walk
name?
through that freezer? Penelope. Oh,
So
How
it'll
you
be up,
doing?
Jack. This will be up on YouTube by tomorrow.
Yeah.
But it
that's
hasn't got the
fast.
graphics and stuff.
yeah, but it'll always
And
be
I might see. I'm
introduced.
going to have to get the editing done to get the graphics in. They wouldn't do it, and they've changed the way they do things here, and I was stuck. They just got the thing with what's his name, and so they didn't get any graphics in. So I'm not sure what I'm going to be able to do.
But you have your host on and you showed the book, so everything is really going to be repetitive.
Well, I could put it up on YouTube. That's the main thing.
Yeah,
And also, that would be high definition.
right.
That wouldn't be the standard definition that you get when you broadcast it.
I'm still waiting to have my opinion. The National Press Club last week.
Yeah, what happened? You sent me a link or something, but
Oh, well, it wasn't. You explained to me that probably was already compressed. You were the one who explained that to me. And
I
then,
have another appointment.
yeah,
so I don't
go.
want to be
Thank
rude.
you, Doc.
Okay,
Thank you
take
for
care,
that.
hon.
I appreciate
All
it
right.
very much.
We've been here a long time.
Penelope.
Take care.
Penelope, no, thank you for
All right. Bye-bye.
doing the show.
Well, they do in the closed studio. In the,
So book the closed studio.
that's what I'm going to start doing. Unless if somebody. Now, the one thing I don't know how to do is, this is the XD cam. You know, how do you stop it and everything? Do you know how to do that?
Stop. Let's see.
I know, but I can't see.